The wind carried an unnatural quiet through the Ozark woods that evening, the kind of silence that seemed to listen. Clara had been following the overgrown trail for hours, her flashlight flickering against the mist. She didn't know what she was looking for exactly, only that the stories wouldn't let her sleep. Locals had called it superstition, the way they always did, a tale about a wedding no one was supposed to speak of, one where the bride and her mother both wore white. But the photograph she found in the thrift store's cracked frame had faces too real, eyes too alive to belong to legend. Clara had always been drawn to the forgotten corners of history, the dust-covered boxes in antique shops, the faded letters that carried someone's life between their creased lines. It was on one of her weekend trips through the Ozark backroads that she found it, a photograph so peculiar that it made her breath catch. The image sat crooked inside a cracked wooden frame at the back of a thrift store that smelled of mildew and pine cleaner. In the picture, two women stood side by side in wedding gowns, each holding a bouquet of wildflowers that had browned with age. Their faces were pale, their smiles uncertain, and between them stood a single man, his hand resting on both their shoulders. It was not the pose of family, nor of friends, but something disturbingly intimate, like a bond that had been forced rather than chosen. The shop owner, a gray-haired woman who spoke little, refused to make eye contact when Clara asked about it. She only muttered, "That one came from up the ridge. Should have burned it, if you ask me." The words hung in the air, making Clara more curious than afraid. There was something about the photograph that felt alive, as though the people in it were aware of being seen again after so many years. She traced her thumb over the back of the frame and noticed faint handwriting etched into the wood, Boone Chapel, 1892. The name stirred something in her memory, an old mention from a folklore book she once read about a family that lived deep in the Ozark wilderness, away from law, church, and time. She bought the photograph for $5 and carried it home in her backpack. That night, under the dim yellow light of her cabin lamp, she studied it again. The longer she looked, the stranger it became. The women, one older, with weary eyes, and one younger, with the same face softened by youth, shared not only resemblance but a kind of mirrored sadness. The man's expression was what haunted her most. He looked proud, almost triumphant, as if the ceremony captured there had sealed more than vows. Clara could not tell if he was the husband, father, or both. She tried searching the name online but found nothing except vague references to disappearances in the mountains during the late 1800s. The Boone family was rumored to have practiced closed marriages, keeping their bloodline pure by any means necessary. That phrase, by any means necessary, lingered in her mind as she set the photo on her desk. Later that night, as the wind moaned against the cabin walls, she could have sworn she heard something faint, a whisper, like a woman's voice repeating vows she didn't want to make, followed by the sound of a second voice echoing the same words, trembling and afraid. The morning after finding the photograph, Clara drove into the small town nearest the ridge, hoping to learn something about the place written on the frame. The town itself looked frozen in time, wooden porches sagging under years of neglect, a faded gas station sign creaking in the wind, and faces that seemed to watch her every move. When she asked about Boone Chapel, conversations stopped mid-sentence. People exchanged uneasy glances, as if she had spoken a name meant only for the dead. An old man sitting outside the general store spat tobacco into the dirt and muttered, "Some things up there ain't meant for strangers." Clara smiled politely, assuming it was just local superstition, but the chill in his tone made her uneasy. At the diner, she tried again, asking the waitress if she knew anything about an old chapel in the woods. The woman froze for a second, her hand tightening around the coffee pot. "You mean the one past Miller's Creek?" she asked quietly, and when Clara nodded, she leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "You stay out of there, honey. Folks who go looking for that place don't come back right." Her words trembled with sincerity, and Clara could tell she wasn't just repeating gossip, she was remembering something. But when Clara pressed for more, the woman shook her head and walked away. By late afternoon, the whispers had followed her everywhere. People stared from behind curtains, from across the road, pretending not to. It was as though her curiosity had awakened something they all preferred to forget. The sheriff's office wasn't much help either. The men behind the desk simply laughed and said, "Boone Chapel's just a story we tell to keep kids out of the woods." Still, the way his eyes avoided hers told a different truth. He gave her a warning disguised as humor. "You don't want to go poking around out there. The woods got their own way of keeping secrets." That night, Clara checked into the only motel in town, an aging structure with buzzing neon lights and a front desk clerk who seemed too eager to hand her a room key. As she unpacked, she noticed how quiet everything became after sunset. Not a single car passed by. Even the crickets fell silent. She stood by the window, staring at the dark line of the forest just beyond the highway. For a moment, she thought she saw a faint light flicker between the trees, like the glow of a candle carried by unseen hands. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but something in her chest tightened. The townspeople's fear wasn't just folklore, it was protection. And whatever they were protecting themselves from was waiting somewhere in those woods, patient and unseen. The next morning, Clara ignored the unease that had crept into her dreams and decided to see the woods for herself. The locals' warnings echoed faintly in her mind, but curiosity outweighed caution. She followed an old dirt road that twisted through dense thickets of pine and oak until it became too narrow for her car. From there, she continued on foot, her boots crunching against fallen leaves and brittle twigs. The forest felt different the deeper she went, heavier, older, as if the air itself carried the memory of things long buried. The sound of her footsteps seemed to vanish before it reached her ears, swallowed by a silence that pressed close around her. After nearly an hour of walking, she came across a clearing where a sagging farmhouse stood beneath the shadow of two enormous trees. Its roof had partially collapsed, and ivy crawled up the sides like veins feeding into something that refused to die. Windows were shattered, the front door missing. The place looked abandoned for decades, yet there was something unsettlingly preserved about it, as though time had stopped just after the last person left. Clara hesitated before stepping inside, her flashlight cutting through the dimness. The floorboards groaned under her weight, and dust swirled around her like pale smoke. The air inside carried a faint trace of perfume, something floral but spoiled, like wilted roses. She wandered through what had once been a living room, where a fireplace sagged under years of soot and cobwebs. A framed picture still hung crookedly on the wall, its glass cracked but the image beneath intact. It was the same chapel from the photograph she'd found, only newer, untouched by decay. A sense of familiarity washed over her, though she had never been there. In the bedroom upstairs, she discovered something that made her heart race. On a wooden dresser, two wedding rings sat side by side on a lace doily, each engraved with the same date, June 13, 1892. The edges were dull with tarnish, but the engraving was unmistakable. She picked one up and felt how unnaturally cold the metal was, even in the warmth of her hand. The second ring bore faint scratches on its inside edge, as though someone had tried to carve something more into it but stopped midway. Next to the rings lay a yellowed piece of cloth, perhaps part of a wedding gown, stiff with age and stained in places that could have been rust, or something else entirely. Clara felt the air shift around her, a faint rustling like footsteps in another room, though she was alone. The scent of wilted flowers grew stronger, and for just a second, she thought she heard the faint sound of a woman's sob echoing through the hollow house, followed by a softer, younger voice whispering her name. Clara returned to town shaken but determined to understand what she had found. The farmhouse had left her with more questions than answers, and the two rings engraved with the same date haunted her thoughts. She spent the morning asking again about the Boone family, but the townspeople avoided her as though she carried the curse herself. Just as she was about to give up, she noticed an elderly woman sitting outside a weathered house near the edge of town, weaving dried herbs into a bundle. Her eyes, pale and sharp, followed Clara with quiet recognition. When Clara approached, the woman spoke first, her voice low and brittle. "You've been where you shouldn't have gone." Clara hesitated, then asked if the woman knew about Boone Chapel or the farmhouse beyond the ridge. The old woman's hands stilled, the herbs trembling slightly between her fingers. "I know more than I want to," she whispered. After a long silence, she invited Clara inside. The house was dim, the air filled with the scent of smoke and lavender. On the mantel stood faded photographs, none smiling, all staring with the same hollow gaze. The woman poured tea but did not drink. "I was the midwife once," she began. "Back when the Boones still lived in those woods." Her story came slowly, broken by pauses and sighs that carried years of regret. She told Clara about Mary Boone, a woman who had tried to flee the family's rule but had been dragged back when she became pregnant. The Boones believed themselves chosen, their blood sacred, and the elders had sworn no outsider would ever taint it. When Mary gave birth to a daughter, they called it a gift, a continuation of their purity. Years later, when the girl was grown, the elders decreed that both mother and daughter would marry the same man, Elijah Boone, the last male heir. It was said to be a ritual of union, a double vow meant to strengthen the bloodline. But to those who witnessed it, it was nothing short of horror. The midwife had helped deliver both of Mary's children and had seen what the inbreeding had done, the deformities, the sickness, the minds that broke too soon. Clara listened, horrified yet unable to look away. The woman's voice shook when she spoke of the wedding day. They held it in the chapel at dusk. 2 brides, 1 groom, and a congregation that didn't dare speak. Her eyes filled with tears she didn't wipe away. When it was over, the daughter never smiled again. And by the next full moon, the mother was gone. Some say she ran. Others say the family buried her in the woods behind the chapel, where the music still plays when the night is right. The name Elijah Boone lingered in Clara's thoughts long after she left the old midwife's house. The woman's story had been soaked in dread, every detail heavy with something unspeakable. That night, Clara searched the town library, a narrow building that smelled of damp paper and dust. Most of the records had long since been lost or burned, but buried within an old ledger of land deeds, she found his name. Elijah Boone, registered owner of 200 acres of forest land, 1891. There was a short note beside it, handwritten by a clerk long dead, no further heirs reported, yet the midwife had spoken of a wedding, of children, of a bloodline determined to continue itself no matter the cost. The contradiction only deepened Clara's obsession. In the quiet of the library, surrounded by the scratching of branches against the windows, she pieced together fragments from local newspapers preserved on brittle microfilm. There were reports of strange gatherings deep in the hills, unexplained fires, missing travelers, whispers of a family who did not welcome outsiders. The Boones had once been respected landowners, but isolation had twisted their pride into something darker. Elijah Boone was said to be the last male heir after generations of self-contained lineage. People called him the Reaper Groom because every woman who stood beside him in marriage either vanished or lost her mind within months. Some claimed the family's inbreeding had not just marred their bodies but also their souls, birthing a kind of madness that passed from one generation to the next like an inheritance. From what Clara read, Elijah was not merely a man but a symbol of the Boone legacy itself, cold, devout, and cruelly obedient to the elders who ruled their secluded clan. It was believed he had been chosen to carry the seed of purity, a phrase repeated in multiple accounts, always quoted but never explained. Those who lived near the woods in that era told of seeing processions by lantern light, winding through the trees toward the chapel, where hymns and screams mingled in equal measure. And then, just as suddenly, the family disappeared. The chapel fell silent, the land reclaimed by the forest, and time buried their story under layers of superstition. As the night deepened, Clara felt the strange sense that she was not uncovering history but disturbing something that had only been sleeping. Every mention of Elijah Boone came with the same description: eyes the color of ash, a voice that could quiet a room, and a presence that made even those who served him feel smaller than their own shadows. It was as if the man had never truly died, only withdrawn into the trees, waiting for the bloodline to call him back. The midwife's words about Mary Boone haunted Clara more than anything else she had heard. She could almost see the woman's face in her mind, pale, weary, trapped between duty and despair. According to the story, Mary had not been born into the Boone family but had been taken in as a distant cousin after her parents died in a winter epidemic. She grew up under the rigid rule of the family elders, who preached that the Boones were chosen to preserve their own kind. Outsiders were forbidden to marry in, and any attempt to leave the settlement was seen as betrayal. Mary, however, had always been restless. She would wander to the edge of the woods at dusk, watching the smoke rise from faraway towns, dreaming of a life beyond the reach of the family's control. One summer, when she was barely 20, she tried to escape. With the help of a traveling preacher who passed through the ridge, she fled under the cover of night. But she didn't get far. The preacher was found 2 days later, throat slit beside the creek, and Mary was dragged back to the Boone homestead. The elders declared her tainted by the outside world and sentenced her to purification. For weeks, she was locked inside a small wooden room near the chapel, forced to fast and recite the old vows of obedience until she was too weak to stand. When she emerged, her spirit seemed broken, and the family announced her engagement to Elijah Boone, the last of the male bloodline. Years later, when Mary gave birth to a daughter, the family rejoiced as if heaven itself had blessed them. The elders said the girl would carry the mother's sin and the father's virtue, and would one day restore the Boone line to purity. Mary's quiet defiance never fully disappeared, though. She began hiding letters in the walls of her home, writing about her fears that the family would do to her daughter what they had done to her. When the girl turned 16, Mary begged the elders to let her send the child away, but they refused. Instead, they decreed something that even Mary could not comprehend: the mother and daughter would share a wedding, bound to the same man. It was to be a ritual of renewal, a symbolic merging of flesh and faith. Mary tried to fight it, but the Boone family's control was absolute. On the night before the wedding, witnesses said they saw her kneeling outside the chapel, praying not for forgiveness, but for an end. Clara couldn't shake the midwife's story from her mind, and the more she learned, the less she slept. Each night she found herself staring into the woods beyond the motel, half expecting to see the faint glow she'd glimpsed before. On the third night, when the moon was thin and the air hung heavy with fog, she decided to return to the ridge. The road twisted upward like a scar through the forest, and every turn seemed to pull her deeper into silence. She parked where the road ended and continued on foot, guided only by the weak light of her flashlight and the pale shimmer of mist drifting low across the ground. The deeper she walked, the quieter everything became: no wind, no rustling leaves, only the dull echo of her heartbeat in her ears. It began faintly, almost too soft to notice at first, a melody, fragile and distant, seeping through the trees. Clara froze, thinking it must have been her imagination, but the sound grew clearer, the slow, uneven rhythm of an organ. The notes wavered as though carried on air too cold for song, yet there was no mistake: it was a wedding tune, old and mournful, like something meant for ghosts instead of the living. The further she walked, the louder it became, echoing between the trunks in a way that made direction impossible to judge. At times it felt close enough to touch, then far away again, swallowed by the fog. Her flashlight flickered, its beam thinning into the darkness. That was when she noticed the lights, tiny, golden flickers moving between the trees. They swayed in unison, almost rhythmic, as if someone were carrying lanterns in a procession. Clara crouched behind a fallen log, her breath shallow, watching them drift closer. For a moment she thought she heard voices, soft murmurs in a language that didn't belong to any she knew. The melody continued, each note pressing deeper into her chest, until she could feel it pulsing through her ribs. When the lights passed a clearing ahead, she saw the faint silhouette of a building through the fog, its peaked roof just visible above the tree-line. Boone Chapel. The same shape from the photograph, the same shadow that haunted the midwife's voice. A cold gust swept through, carrying the scent of old flowers and something metallic beneath it, something like rust, or blood. The organ music stopped all at once, leaving the forest drenched in silence so deep it seemed to hum. Then, from somewhere beyond the chapel, came the faint sound of laughter, two voices, one older, one younger, twisting together in a way that made her blood turn to ice. Clara moved through the clearing as quietly as she could, her flashlight dimmed to a narrow beam. The fog clung thick around her ankles, curling upward like smoke from a dying fire. The closer she drew to the shape of the chapel, the more she felt the weight of something unseen pressing against her chest. The building stood crooked on its foundation, its wooden boards warped and gray, the steeple half collapsed. Yet the faint glow of candlelight flickered behind its cracked stained glass windows. She paused at the edge of the clearing, her breath shallow, unsure if she was looking at the living or something far older. The forest behind her felt as if it had closed in completely, the path back swallowed by darkness. There was nowhere to go but forward. Each step toward the chapel sounded impossibly loud against the silence. The air carried the faint scent of burnt wax and damp earth. The closer she got, the clearer the details became: ivy creeping up the doorframe, the heavy wooden doors carved with strange, looping patterns that looked less like decoration and more like symbols. She reached for the handle, and to her surprise, it turned easily beneath her hand. The door opened with a long, aching groan, revealing the interior bathed in the dim light of half-melted candles. Rows of pews stretched toward a small altar at the front, where a decaying wreath of flowers still rested as if the ceremony had only just ended. Clara stepped inside, every instinct screaming for her to turn back. The floor creaked beneath her, dust drifting down from the rafters above. Along the walls hung faded photographs, some framed, others nailed directly into the wood. She approached one and realized they were all wedding portraits. Each photograph showed the same chapel, the same man standing beside different women, his face unchanging through decades. The brides, however, looked progressively weaker, their expressions more hollow, as though each had been drained of something vital. A sound made her freeze, the faint shuffle of movement behind the altar, followed by a whisper so soft she wasn't sure it was real. Her flashlight caught a glimpse of something pale moving through the shadows, but when she turned, there was nothing. The air grew colder, the candle flames bending as if drawn toward some unseen presence. She took another step and noticed the floorboards near the altar were darker, stained with something old that had seeped deep into the wood. At the center lay two small indentations, circular and perfectly aligned, as if two wedding rings had rested there and burned themselves into the floor. From somewhere within the walls, the sound of footsteps began again, measured, deliberate, and moving closer. Clara's breath came shallow as she moved deeper into the chapel, the beam of her flashlight trembling in her hand. The smell of dust and rot mixed with something faintly sweet, like decayed flowers left too long on a grave. She raised her light toward the back wall, and her pulse quickened. Dozens of photographs covered every inch of it, layered over one another in uneven rows, their edges curling and yellowed with age. The faces in them were disturbingly familiar, generations of the same family, all bearing identical features. The same pale eyes, the same crooked smiles, the same men appearing again and again beside different women. Elijah Boone's face never changed, not even in photos that should have been decades apart. Time had touched everything in that chapel except him. She stepped closer, brushing aside cobwebs to reveal more images hidden underneath. Some were formal portraits, others candid, blurred moments caught mid-motion. In a few, the bride's veils had slipped, revealing eyes red and swollen from tears. Others showed gatherings of pale children standing before the chapel doors, their heads tilted at the same eerie angle, as if they'd all been taught to pose that way. Clara's stomach twisted as she realized the pattern. Each new generation mirrored the last, the features recycling endlessly until they no longer looked human but sculpted, copied, and worn down by repetition. It was as though the family had been folding in on itself, breeding its own reflection until the line between life and memory blurred completely. Her flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the room into a suffocating darkness. For a few heartbeats, she heard nothing but the sound of her own breathing. Then came the faint rustle of fabric behind her, followed by the unmistakable creak of the floorboards shifting under weight. Clara turned on her light again, its beam weak and stuttering. The photographs now seemed closer somehow, their glass surfaces glinting as if wet. In one of them, she thought she saw movement, the faint twitch of an eye, the hint of a smile widening. A sudden draft swept through the chapel, snuffing out several candles at once. The air grew heavy with the scent of burnt wax and cold earth. She felt something brush against her shoulder, light, almost like the edge of a veil. Her flashlight slipped from her hand and rolled across the floor, its beam cutting a crooked path along the wall. For just an instant, the light caught a mirror hidden behind the photographs. Reflected within it were not the faded images she had been studying but dozens of faces staring back at her from the darkness, each one bearing her own eyes. Clara backed away from the wall, her pulse hammering in her ears. The mirror still glimmered faintly through the gaps between the photographs, its surface rippling as though it were breathing. She stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape, but the air inside the chapel had thickened, every breath feeling heavier than the last. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet as if the building itself were shifting to keep her there. Somewhere behind her, a faint sound rose, a soft hum, the same wedding tune she had heard before, now clearer, stronger, as if being played from beneath the floor. The candlelight wavered, and for a moment, it seemed like shadows were moving between the pews, flickering shapes that weren't her own. She turned to run, but the chapel door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. The music grew louder, and then came footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing from the altar. Clara's flashlight sputtered back to life for an instant, just long enough for her to see two figures emerging from the darkness at the far end of the room. They were dressed in wedding gowns, their veils long and tattered, their hands clasped as if walking down an invisible aisle. The taller figure lifted her head first, revealing the hollow, weary face of an older woman whose eyes seemed both empty and aware. The younger followed, her face nearly identical but softer, fresher, and somehow sadder. Clara recognized them immediately, the mother and daughter from the photograph. Between them stood a shadow that took shape as it drew closer. A man, tall and rigid, wearing a black suit that looked as though it had been dug from the earth. His eyes were pale gray, lifeless but unblinking, his expression that same unsettling calm captured in every picture. Elijah Boone. His hand reached out, not toward the women but toward Clara, as if she had been expected. The music stopped all at once, leaving only the creak of the floor and her heartbeat pounding against her ribs. The air grew colder, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she heard whispers, voices repeating vows in a trembling chorus, ancient words promising union and obedience. Clara stepped back, but her heel caught on something. She looked down to find 2 wedding rings lying in the dust, freshly gleaming despite the decay around them. Before she could move, a soft hand brushed hers, icy and fragile. The younger bride stood before her now, veil lifting slowly, lips moving without sound. Clara understood then what the townsfolk had meant: the Boones had never died. They had only been waiting for someone to continue the vow.